The global politics of oil and the shifting balance of power. What impact are lower prices having on international relations? And how is surging production in the US playing into a potentially volatile mix? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, it drives industry and economies, heats homes and keeps us on the move. In short, oil can be considered as important as food and water, and its supply and how much it costs can have an enormous impact on the lives of billions of people. But it also shapes the geopolitical landscape. That's international relations and foreign policy. And the current period of low prices is bringing all that into sharp focus. The price of crude oil, for example, has tumbled since last June, down almost 50% from $115 a barrel, hovering now a little below $60 a barrel. There are a number of things affecting global oil prices at the moment, not least weakening global demand, particularly in China and the European Union. Then there's the OPEC factor. You'll remember at its last meeting in November, the cartel of oil producers decided against cutting production in order to protect its own market share. Protecting it from the likes of the US, we're told, which has overtaken Saudi Arabia to become the world's largest oil producer using a process known as fracking. Well, then there's the backdrop this is set against. The current energy sanctions against Russia and Iran, both, of course, rich in oil and gas. We can't forget the conflicts in Syria, Iraq and Libya too. Again, all with significant oil reserves. And we can throw into the picture the troubles in oil-producing areas of Nigeria and South Sudan. And we're left with a big question here of how are all these changing dynamics impacting the way states deal with each other? Thoughts to put to our guests who are attending the Gulf Intelligence Energy Forum here in Doha. From the forum itself, we have Sean Evers, Managing Partner for Gulf Intelligence, a strategic corporate communications and consultancy firm based in Dubai. And with me here in the studio is Keisuke Sadamori, Director of Energy Markets and Security at the International Energy Agency, and Barbara Judge, Chairman of the Energy Institute at the University College in London. Welcome to you all. Good to have you here. Barbara, let's start with you if we could. How long are low oil prices going to last? Is this a long-term thing?
I don't think anybody knows. I've been speaking at a number of conferences and talking to lots of people. There are many people that think that it's a short-term thing, but it can't be that short-term because it takes a while for the market to readjust. We think... So
your crystal ball says it's not just a quick flash in the pan.
I don't think so. I think it'd take a little while just to get out of from where we are.
Sadamori, Keisuke, low oil prices are basically, what are we looking at? Is this a standoff between frackers and OPEC to see who'll blink first?
Well, in a sense, the current lower oil prices since the middle of last year, that's the result of the robust supply growth, in particular from the non-OPEC the countries, including the North American shale fracking, and weaker demand outlook compared with the kind of past expectations. And that situation is still continuing, and so that has led to the enormous stock build, in particular in the United States, North America.
Yeah, they're overstocked right now,
yes.
Or they're fully stocked in oil, aren't they? And that's part of the things keeping the oil prices low. Sean, can the frackers survive if this is a game of who'll blink first? The break-even point is pretty high for some of the frackers, isn't it? Is this the strategy of OPEC?
Yeah, I think one would not underestimate the endurance of U.S. shale producers who are fracking, as you say. I think there was an expectation generally that under $60, $70 oil, they'd be in a lot of pain and would be dropping like flies. But the reality is that they are very, very capable producers with the latest technologies. And at the end of the day, they're there to make a profit. And as long as there's 50 cents on every barrel or $1 on a barrel or whatever it might be, they're going to be producing. So,
but hang on, Sean, are they still making a profit here?
Major producers from OPEC would like... Well, if they're still in business, I would suggest that most of them are still making $1. you know, the American companies don't like to be operating if they're not making profit. So I think you can expect that a lot of them, some will start to fall by the wayside, but a lot of them will still be making profits at the moment and be very happy with, okay, they might be making $100, but $60 is still good for a lot of them. And you also have to remember that many frackers, shale producers in America, would also have hedged their forward production, which means they would have sold on their forward production at $100, at $90. Not all of it, but certainly a good percentage of it. The smart ones would have.
All right,
and as a result,
that's a really
the price
good point.
right now, they wouldn't be feeling the pain.
Let me take that point. Barbara, you know the US oil industry pretty well, don't you? I mean, how are these guys surviving, and what happens after the hedge contracts run out?
Well, first of all, I agree with a lot of what Sean said. A number of them will have hedged forward, and therefore they'll be protected for a period of time. The other thing that's important to note is a lot of big players are in the fracking business now. It didn't used to be that way.
Some of the big traditional oil companies.
Exactly.
Right.
It used to be that it was just the outliers that were doing that. But some of the big traditional oil companies have taken a big play in the Bakken and Eagle Ford and the various places. And they have money to stay for a long time till the cycle changes.
But they still don't have the reserves, the national reserves that OPEC, some of the OPEC countries have.
No, but I think they have staying power. But I think
for how long?
Important. Well, before we get to that, I think what's very important is to think about what fracking has done to the psyche of the U.S. Whether or not they're going to be making the same kind of profits they thought they were going to be making, the population in America thinks it's going to be energy independent. It thinks it's not going to have to depend on the Gulf or Russia. It's going to be able to take care of itself. That whole emotional exuberance is bringing manufacturing back to America and is actually fueling the economy. When everybody else is losing money, America's making money because we, the Americans, think fracking is the future. And they're not going to want to give up that dream so quickly, no matter what the short-term reality is.
I'm going to ask you in a moment whether, you know, as you say, the American people think. I want to ask you, is that the reality? But first, let's just bring people up to speed on what we're talking about when we say fracking. US oil production is at its highest since 1970, mainly because of fracking. This is when it's a process when a mixture of water, sand and other chemicals is pumped at high pressure into shale deep below the surface, and this allows oil and natural gas to escape, which is then drawn back up to the surface. It's revolutionized the US oil industry, which is currently pumping out some 9 million barrels a day. And that's helping to reduce oil imports. According to the US Energy Information Administration, liquid fuels consumption fell from 60% in 2005 to an estimated 27% in 2014. So it's been quite a drop. KSK, there's also a bit of tension between OPEC members as well. I mean, different OPEC countries have different break-even points themselves. They have different reserve levels. What's the long-term outlook for tension and friction within OPEC if this drags on, this standoff between OPEC and the frackers?
There's obviously a kind of difference among the various OPEC countries. The OPEC countries in the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they are somewhat in a better position in terms of the higher level of cushion and the capacity to kind of endure longer than other countries. And there are others like Venezuela and others who is having a real hard time in responding to the current, the lower oil market environment.
And Barbara, on the point you were talking about there, about how there's a lot of optimism, expectation in the US that the US is on the road perhaps to self-sufficiency at some point. When you look at some of the numbers, it does sound exciting. US imports from OPEC countries in 2014 reaching their lowest level in 30 years. Exciting from the US perspective, not very good obviously if you're an OPEC producer. How much of that is reality? How much is just hype?
Well, I think it's half and half. I think the numbers show that, in fact, oil imports are down and have been going down for a long period of time, as you just explained. The fact is, however, that fracking is a short-term proposition, so that it won't go on forever. We'll have to keep finding new wells to drill for fracking. So there'll have to be money in order to support the new fracking. So I think most of it is about psychology. I think a lot of it is about the feeling in America that independence is close and that therefore the Americans can let the rest of their economy go up, along with the fact that oil prices are going down. And that that's fueling America to give them the staying power to stay in the fracking business till it actually gets powerful again and profitable again.
All right, Sean, what does this all mean for politics at this point? If at this point, at least, it's safe to say that the US reliance on imported oil is going down, what does it mean? Does it give the US more flexibility when dealing with some of the oil-producing nations, whether it's in the Middle East, whether we're talking in Venezuela, in South America, and so on and so forth?
Well, I think it's important to firstly acknowledge that while the U.S. are not importing as much oil as they were, they're up to 9, but they consume about 20 million barrels a day. So that's still another 10 or 11 million barrels that they have to get every day, a lot of it coming from neighbors in Canada and Mexico, Venezuela. But still, it is imported oil that they're still very much dependent on. I think really that's just another kind of a jargon idea in energy independence. Everybody in the world strives for energy independence, but the world is a global marketplace. Nobody can sort of live in isolation on an island. Oil prices are affected by remote events in Africa or the Middle East or many different places. They'll affect the price of oil in New York. So none of this is independent of each other. It's all one global market. There are some subtle differences, of course, in terms of some pricing structures in America versus the rest of the world, but it is essentially one place. One cannot be divorced. One cannot be an island. Energy independence is a nonsense.
All right, interesting point, Barbara, there. It is all interrelated, and you know that very well as anyone. Are we seeing some interrelationships here when we look at how, for example, how cautious the US has been in intervening militarily in some of the conflict zones involving oil producers, whether it's in Iraq or Syria, compared to how quick the US was to intervene militarily when Iraq under Saddam invaded Kuwait? There is at least a difference here in degree, isn't there? Is that because of America's oil status and standing?
I actually don't think so.
No.
I don't think that. I think the Saddam Kuwait situation was a different America. They were united behind the president. Everybody understood what the president was doing, and the country was very supportive. I think if you look at America now, the country itself is quite divided on whether they should be intervening quickly or not. We've had a lot of experience with intervening that has gone better and some has gone worse. Look at Iraq. So I think the whole country is less anxious to get involved in other places, and the president is less anxious, this president is, than the president was in those days when we had the first George Bush. So I think it's more politics, domestic politics, than international politics.
All right, KSK, when you look at some of the facts and the stats, it's very clear that the US is less of a customer for OPEC today than it was in the past. The OPEC's share of US oil imports dropping 59% in the last 6 years. Does this mean that many oil producers in the Gulf region are looking increasingly more and more towards Asia and the East rather than the West?
In a sense, if we see the kind of a global, the crude trade maps, we can obviously see the shift toward the east. In the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. is importing less, while we are seeing the
increase
the
in
Asian,
China, for example. Yeah.
Yes, Asian emerging economies like China, India, or the ASEAN countries, they are the one who has been and will lead the global demand growth. So therefore, we will continue to see that the market center of gravity of the market will be shifting further eastward in the coming decades.
Interesting. And Sean, as the gravity shifts further eastwards, what sort of political implications will that have for Gulf countries, for oil-producing countries?
The irony now is that the American Fifth Fleet, which is sitting not too far away from us here, is actually protecting Chinese oil. It's actually providing a security corridor for all of the energy to move out of this region to move to Asia, because as you say, very little of it actually goes to the United States. There is really, for all intents and purposes, no longer an energy connection between the Gulf and the US. Saudi Arabia maintains one by exporting to the US, but on very small quantities and at a discounted rate in really oil that could go to other markets. But they maintained the supply to America for geopolitical relationship reasons. 90% of the energy coming out of the Gulf is going to Asia, and a lot of that is going, the biggest customer being China, and yet the Chinese don't provide any of the security corridor for that energy. And so that is a big question that's going to have to resolve itself, particularly if there is the multiple hundreds of billions of dollars that the American taxpayer is paying, and the Americans are generally not getting Chinese payback in terms of global geopolitical cooperation, or they're really migrating towards a competitive relationship. So that's a square that has to be circled.
Do you really think, though,
in some
Sean,
way
can you see the day that the US will perhaps bring back its role and its activities, as you put it, in the energy corridor? Because ultimately, even if, as you've pointed out, it's getting less and less energy from the Gulf, any movement in the Gulf can still impact the global oil prices. And as you pointed out, the US is still getting a lot of its oil is still imported.
Yes, there's clearly a economic interest in order to have stable supply in the context of its impact on prices. The interesting thing right now is, given the list of countries you mentioned on the introduction that are now in some level of conflict or turmoil, that we're not seeing a geopolitical premium in the oil price at the moment. There's generally a sort of out of sight, out of mind kind of a mentality to the geopolitical risk of the oil price. But at some point in time, the grand bargain, if you like, between the United States and China vis-a-vis the Americans paying the whole bill for the security of the energy corridor, is that in return they get cooperation, or they should get cooperation from the Chinese when it comes to diplomatic, whether it becomes policy on Iran or policy on Syria or policy in the South China Sea and so on. And the reality is that the Americans are not getting a lot of payback for that quid pro quo, if you like. And so at some point there's going to have to be, that issue is going to have to be taken up. And I don't think one can expect that the U.S. will continue to be the paymaster for the energy security of China.
There'll have to be a rethink. Barbara, you're angling to get in there.
Well, I just don't think that's explicit anymore. I think that's what the people understood was the deal at some point, which was that America was going to keep the peace in this region because it supplied everybody's energy, particularly the U.S. and China. I think the leadership in China now is very independent, and it thinks that it can look after itself. It's just made its deal with Russia, which was on very good terms. And I don't think it feels as beholden to America as we think, Americans think, that it should be or ought to be. I do agree with that, the point that there isn't a lot of payback. On the other hand...
So hang on, what does this mean, guys? Sean, does this mean we're looking at a less stable oil market in the future?
I think the Chinese think they can sort of have their cake and eat it on a lot of things, because everybody to a great extent has a desperation to access the Chinese market, whether you're selling chocolate bars or Mercedes or Chevrolets. There's this sense that you have to be into China. So the Chinese are very, very good at sort of have been very talented at taking advantage of that. But the Chinese are desperate for the Americans to maintain an energy security corridor. And they were very nervous in the last year or two when there was even rumors of any sort that America might be thinking otherwise to cut back on military budgets and so on.
Right, all right. Well, it's been a while now since OPEC was established. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries was formed at the Baghdad Conference in 1960. The founding members, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait and Venezuela. The group has since expanded to include 12 countries. Its goal is to set production limits and oil prices to best support producers and consumers. And in the decade after OPEC was formed, member countries were producing more than half the world's oil. The cartel showed its strength in 1973 when Arab countries imposed an embargo in response to the US policy in the Middle East and forced up oil prices. OPEC still produces around 40% of the world's oil and, for now at least, remains a strong influence on prices. But Keisuke, if we're looking at some of the factors we're talking about now, OPEC's perhaps share of the oil production, the global oil production has gone down. The US might, as Sean is pointing out, has to at some point start reconsidering its security role in the energy corridor. Where does this leave the global energy market? Are we looking at less and less of a empowered policeman there to ensure stability?
Well, first of all, if we take a look at the current market, yes, the U.S. Light tight oil, unconventional oil resources, has been bringing in the very robust supply growth by the non-OPEC countries. And in a sense, in particular, what I need to point out is the fact that those U.S. light tight oil is quite price elastic, more price elastic than the conventional the oil resources than those in OPEC or other part of the world. So in a sense,
so how does OPEC control that when they're getting less and less influence on the oil market, for example?
So
who becomes the price policeman?
Well, exactly, not so much of the need for the price policeman. In a sense, with the emergence of those price elastic, the non-OPEC supply from the U.S. light tight oil, the market function is becoming more enhanced in terms of responding to the price signals. So that's what we are seeing right now. So in a sense, the recent the OPEC response to the changing reality of the market may be the one, in a sense, they may be responding quite optimally to the changing dynamics of this the oil market. But one thing we need to be careful is that current well-supplied market situation should not lead to the kind of complacency, because the current well-supplied market may blind us from the energy security concern, which is actually around the corner.
Right.
And the point is,
things can change.
Yes, and in particular, the robust growth from the U.S. light tight oil, this will not last forever. So a lot of the institutions are forecasting that the robust growth of the U.S. light tight oil will somewhat lose steam.
All right, but even if
somewhere in the 2020.
All right, even if that declines, what happens, Barbara, when we start to get
forever.
Nothing does last forever, Sean. What happens, Barbara, when we start to get the oil production back up to where it should be in countries like Libya, Iraq, Syria, perhaps even Iran, if sanctions are lifted?
Well, first of all, those are countries that have a lot of oil, but it's not that much compared to what the world is going to need. Everybody's been saying that it's 9 billion people by 2020. I mean, the world is going to need more and more oil, gas, and various other kinds of energy sources, so that to the extent that
that's not going to be provided by alternative energy. That's still a pipe dream.
I don't believe that neither sun nor wind can actually do very much when you have to talk about big blocks of baseload generation. You know, I think every country needs an energy mix. It needs oil and it needs gas. Look, people are burning coal now because they need more energy and it's inexpensive. We need renewables. That's a source of nuclear, because that's a source of baseload generation.
Right.
And we want renewables because it makes us feel better. But all of the countries, even if we get everybody back on the table, there's a great need for new energy sources and more energy as we go forward into the later years, 2020, 2030. I think we're going to use it all up.
Okay, so very briefly, Sean, does that mean the frackers are here to stay in the long term, and so are the traditional oil producers, and we're back to where we started in this show?
Well, there is the sense that demand growth over the 30, 40-year horizon, there's room for every sort of energy that you can bring to the table. But I do think the frackers will be here a lot longer than some give the outlook for. But just to make the note on the OPEC, the cost of OPEC being the world's policeman on oil prices is far too expensive now. As their market share declines, they have to cut much bigger amounts in order to impact the price. They're not willing to do that anymore.
All right, we'll have to leave the discussion here for now. Let's thank Sean, Barbara and Keisuke for your participation in this show. And thank you for joining us. If you've got anything you'd like to add, you can go over to our programme page at aljazeera.com. You can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or send us your tweets to @AJ Inside Story. I'm Sami Zaidan. From the whole team for now, it's goodbye.